Hey everybody, this is Achilles Justice with the Philosophy Society. It's November 8th, 2023. We're in the Toronto Metropolitan University Library, room 661B. We have new people today, very nice. People returning friends, very good. So we'll just start with, does anybody have anything they want to talk about? Because that's like, I have so many things.
Well, let's get this started, and if something comes up, for sure.
Okay, all right. Anything else on the mind? No? Okay. So last week it was an interesting time. I just started off with, what do you think? And I went from that point, and I talked about what could we think about in general, and how do we think, right? So thinking was kind of the initial impetus and how we started our discussion. We went into many other topics from that. And so maybe just like a quick overview, part of the purpose of what we're doing is philosophy is known as the love of wisdom. And predominantly, philosophy has been studied through the mode of reasoning as a method. So to love wisdom is to be reasonable. But wisdom in itself, as an entity, so one facet is reason, but it's also how we live our lives. I like to give the example of, if you've seen two people arguing at each other on the street, and then you've seen like a family, right? And they have some balance there. And you'd say, where is there more wisdom? Most people would say that it's not in the people who are arguing. That is like contrary to what is wise. It might be the people that are happy or balanced in their life. They have well-being. So well-being, how to live, I would say is fundamentally tied to what it means to be philosophical.
Everyone has their own philosophies, correct? That might be contradicting with each other. Just how like a few of the points of the older philosophers, don't quote me, I don't know any, but I'm sure they also have conflicting views when it comes to philosophy, like in the Roman side compared to like the Greek side.
Okay. So yes. So in different philosophies, so like Plato and Aristotle, there may be conflicts within that on what it means to be philosophical. Whether it's like using dialogue as in Plato's writings, or Aristotle's discussion of ethics and how to be a virtuous person, right? Plato talks about the theory of forms, and Aristotle is very practical in some ways.
What do you mean by forms?
So he says that every idea is rooted in some form of the thing that is in like a different existence or way of being or reality than our own. So when you have like a triangle, that's not really a triangle. It's a representation of the form of a triangle. And the form of a triangle is always inaccessible to us. And so there's this whole world of forms, like the world of ideas.
Like the structure kind of?
Yeah, so like the number 3. The true number 3 exists in the world of forms. It doesn't exist in this reality. We can see representations of 3, but the world of forms is abstracted from our world. And so another one could be like David Hume contradicting what Immanuel Kant says. Kant would talk about sense, and then Hume would talk about sense, and Kant would talk about duty as a way that we would arrive at ethics, right? And so these people have certain views of the world, and they may disagree on certain points, and we can philosophize, or we can reasonably discuss the meaning of these things, but that conversation, so like you have a person and there's different actions the person can do. So 1 is you can like talk, right? 2 is you can read stuff. 3 is you can have conversations. You could think. right? These actions can be relevant to this, what philosophers have discussed in the past.
Art,
Yes, like, yeah, sure, okay. Yeah. And so all of these actions are relevant to this, but there's other things we do in life that are different than trying to make sense of what the philosophers have talked about in the past, right? You can take these ideas and you can just implement them in life in general, like in being an ethical person, for example. So being philosophical, I'm saying, is not only limited to just these actions that are relevant. I guess writing is another one, right? You like students write essays. That's what they do. I just showed you 2 of them the other day. And so those are things we can do relative to these books that these other philosophers have written, right? These ideas that they had, they communicated in a form of writing. I'm gonna have to go get this person.
Mhm.
Keep it a moment. So talk amongst yourselves. Taking the coffee with. Okay, we're back. Okay, so I'm going to do a little review so that we're on the same page again. So you're caught up with us. So basically, last week we were talking about thinking, and I started the discussion just thinking, what do you think? What do you guys think? And from there, we talked about normative and descriptive ways of thinking, and then modes of thinking, like how to think about things, pitfalls of thinking, how we can have errors and whatnot, and then how it's done socially as a group, and then problems that can arise from that. And so today, because we have some new people, I always like to justify why we're here in the first place. I think that makes sense. Like, why did you come to this place, you know? And part of it is, you know, for philosophy. So what does philosophy mean? Philosophy defined as the love of wisdom, and really focusing on the wisdom part, we would say that well-being is something that is wise, you know? There's certain things in life or decisions we could make or consequences that would go contrary to wisdom. It's unwise to do this. And so the faculty of the mind would say, oh, don't do it then. And then if you're inexperienced maybe, and you just don't know what's going on, you ask somebody, you say, what should I do here? And really you're looking for wisdom. You want to not make certain mistakes.
what if you still do it? After you have the knowledge of it.
Mhm.
And for some reason you still do it.
So that-
like a bad habit, let's say.
Yeah, so there can be a psychological component to it. And in a lot of instances there is, right?
Like a cycle, like something triggers you, and like not like in a PTSD way, but like a habit is,
Like a cue.
yeah, a cue.
So sometimes we can do things that are unwise. And the wisdom, so that's why wisdom, for the way that I'm approaching it with this organization, is not limited to reason alone. Right? It's how we live our lives, which is part of that is being reasonable. It's learning what philosophy is, but also how do we apply this? So it's not just an armchair discipline that we read it and then we put it aside and we go back to living our lives, right? Analogously, I bring this up often, is over here, we have religion. And religion in some ways, for thousands of years, has taken the territory of how to live. They're like, we know how to do it. We got this guy upstairs, he's the manager, tells you good to go, right? And that may be the case, maybe. But maybe it's not the case. So in how to live our lives, from here, habit is a thing. And it's important for us to understand the nature of habit. This is a wise thing, to understand what it means to be human. And that's why psychology is fundamentally tied to wisdom and living well, right? And so habit is one thing. So one of the modules of the Philosophy Society, so we have the main theoretical discussion, which is the Wednesday meetings right now, right? And then there would be modules, which would be like learning about habit, learning about emotions, which are like courses, okay? And then there would be like a group-based application group meeting where people would open themselves up to feedback and criticism, because we're going to learn more that way. So you would talk about your personal experiences, get the group to give you their perspectives on that, and then from that integrative setting, you'll be able to grow more from it and understand yourself better. But that one's very voluntary. You can't just start throwing that stuff at people because it's not easy to necessarily do. And the last one is just like integration in the world, right? It's a very brief, like structure of how I view the organization, and it's open to discuss. How can we make it better? What's missing? But at the very least, content-specific time is important, like educating ourselves. What is the nature of emotions? How does it affect things like depression? And we went through a course last year together. Individual-based stuff, making it relative to whoever is here is important because I'm speaking generally. We're not going into details. Like, for example, if someone's like, my partner cheated on me. That happened, you know? What do I do about that? What is the nature of cheating, right? And because we do it in a group setting, it also will meet other needs that we'll find in things like group therapy and stuff. Not that we're going to say that we're doing group therapy because that would be illegal, but the same phenomena that occurs is equal, right? And so that is a function of nature. And so we might as well paddle with the current in the river. Going against the current is going to make things difficult. We may need to do that sometimes, but going against the forces of nature usually is going to be unwise. Just doesn't make sense. And we can engage our faculty of reason to understand that. So that would be one, right? How do we test things? So one is through reason. You could say a priori, this makes sense or doesn't, but maybe I'm still wrong. Maybe something happened in our discussion and I just didn't understand things, right? So what do? We do some kind of an experiment. So we're going to be empirical, right? And go out into the field, go out into the world and see what happens, see if it works. Now, there are problems with that. It can be anecdotal, right? There can be issues of correlation, causation. I may not really see the nature of things. It just appears a certain way to me. And this is where this kind of a thing is not science. We are utilizing science in our lives to better our lives, right? So we don't want to confuse the two. All right. So the habit thing, right, would be one of those modules. And so one of the books on habit called The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. And it's a good book. There are other things we can talk about, like operant and classical conditioning to understand the nature of stimulus response.
Can you say that again?
Operant and classical conditioning. So classical conditioning, we have Pavlov's dogs, where there's the stimulus of the bell ringing, which creates the salivation and anticipation for food. In operant conditioning, we have B.F. Skinner, which is the consequences of some event or stimulus will create some behavioral response. That's part of the nature of habit. We also see a lot of work in habits and addictions work, because fundamentally the property of addictions is the individual not able to resist the stimulus of the substance, and then they engage in self-harming behavior, right? So within habit, one of the, I say psychology generally here, but we want to be a bit more specific. Psychological properties. So when I say this, and I've been thinking about recently the last week or so, what are the things? You know, when you talk about psychology, like what is the actual thing there that you're pointing at, right? When we say sensation and perception, you can say, well, I have this thing called vision. I can perceive the light spectrum. There's a visible spectrum of light, and it reflects off objects in the world. And if the rods and cones in my eyes are working correctly, I can see variations in light and dark, and I can see color. It's a beautiful thing, right? I can navigate my environment. I don't walk into shit or fall off cliffs and stuff. I can see if there's a threat, and I can move away from it, right? So that's useful. But when we talk about the mind or behaviorally, what other properties exist? And so it's difficult to define these things. Like if we're going to put a box around it and say that X exists, right? So how do we know that it's true that the thing we're saying is real? And so one of these properties, going back to the thing you talked about, habit, self-control or impulse control. So I'd like to say that's a property. In the meta-analysis of how do we even define what a property is in this sense, I think is important to really discuss, but we're just going to leave that aside for now. And we'll just assume that it is such a thing. And self-control defined as the ability to say no. There's some faculty of the mind, which is based on organelles in the brain, the combination of those two that says, I'm going to resist this thing, whatever this thing might be. Saying / behaving. No, right? You can resist. So we see impulse control or self-control in the addictions discussion. And with what Dimitri was saying earlier, well, what if I know it's unwise, but I do anyways, right? So one of those facets would be the person isn't saying no, right? So we could look at that. Other things we could talk about is like personality, a certain way of being that cuts across situations and states. This person generally acts this way, independent of the circumstance, right? Okay, let's just do a room check. Where are you guys? Do anything you guys want to bring up, or shall we deviate course? So I'm going on a certain trajectory right now.
In terms of conditioning,
Mhm.
there's also insight learning.
Okay.
Which is when, like, classical is where you have like the stepwise stimulus response thing.
Mhm.
Insight is when you sort of jump from one context to another. So the classic example is the outside the box thinking from
Okay.
with the dots and whatnot.
Very good, thank you. Or like the eureka, or so it would be similar to the eureka moment, like when a person demonstrates understanding, like they connect things together in that
Yeah,
insight,
something like that.
or more like the out of the box thinking, like abstract thought.
Well, it's the outside the box thinking is something to do with context or something.
Okay.
I can't remember
Okay.
exactly, but that key piece of insight that you gotta draw a line and an imaginary dot outside the box
Okay.
leads to the solution.
Yeah, it's similar to like Maslow's hammer, where they have like the matchbox and the paper, the thumbtack, and you have to, and a candle. You have to think of a different way to utilize the objects, and it has to do with
Yeah.
functional fixedness.
Yeah.
That what we do is when we look at a certain thing and we're used to using it in that way, we only see it within that context. So going with the information you're bringing forward, it would be being able to see it outside of that context. And it's usually very difficult for people to disengage, right, from what they're used, how they're used to looking at things. And so Maslow's hammer, the quote is, when all you know is how to use a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Okay, so all of this is going back to wisdom and how we live our lives. So when we talk about the philosophy society in this context, right, the theoretical discussion part, this is more of me explaining generally what our approach is from like a philosophical sense, because we're not really going into like a training thing where, for example, you talk about your day and then we identify the cognitive distortions in the way that you look through your day, and then we reformulate new ways to do it, right? We could do that, and I'm not against that. It's just that this specific rendition of how I view what a social group can bring to people, right? And how we can best use our time. I kind of have to start up here and then work our way down. Because if I go down here and I do like the emotion course, which we did before, it may seem out of context, right? Because you don't know the bigger picture. But once we get more people, then I'll just maybe do a Zoom thing and we can do more courses then. So the next one would be the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, which is written by Stephen Covey. It's very useful for many reasons. And then also the one by Charles Duhigg. That's also good. Just again, I only have so much time. So, okay, how we live. So when we look over here at facilitators, so if there's a person that's doing these specific things, right, there is some kind of training that is necessary, I would say, to competently be able to stand here and integrate what people say and make sense of it. And so that's where studying the philosophers is useful, So you understand how this information is put within the context of what they've said, right? Which is slightly different than just studying psychology. So, yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts before I?
Mentioned psychology. I was thinking is probably a young philosopher as well, or is he just strictly psychologist?
Well, he's, comes from, he was Freud's student, right? So he's coming out of psychoanalysis and kind of revamped it in his own way. But you could call him a philosopher. Generally, people would label somebody as a philosopher. Like when I read someone, I'm like, how is this guy a philosopher? Like I was reading Kierkegaard recently. I was like, oh man. But then when they cite philosopher after philosopher and how they tie their examples together, that's kind of, they're building off of the ideas of those people. So you're like, okay, I can see how this person is part of like the, they call it a long conversation since like Plato until today-ish.
So I think Jung was inspired by Kant. Kant is a philosopher in his earlier days.
But their views are not very aligned, right?
Jung and Kant?
Yeah.
Kant and Jung he may have been inspired, but they were talking about very different things, for sure. I think Jung is going into like the nature of the unconscious. I haven't read a lot of Jung, but in what I know about Jung, he has these archetypes as like unconscious, I'm giving it my own kind of definition, unconscious senses of self that will kind of like motivate you to behave and act in a certain way, but also how you read things.
And
Or how you-
explains why you also behave in those ways and how. Certain.
No, that's great. Which is in contrast to Freud, that will talk about the id, ego, and superego as his general way of explaining why people do things. Sorry, could you-
Remember that book Rez told you to read? Rez is his name, right? Look in your guy with the glasses with the long hair. Riz.
Riz, yes. Which book did you tell me to read?
He told you to read the Red Book by Carl Jung.
Oh yeah, that's a cool book. There's a lot of illustrations in that book.
I listened to the audiobook and it was very well put together book.
Right.
Apparently it was his journal before he passed away. And it's basically all his philosophies from his whole life and then his final conclusion after living for 70, 80 years.
Okay, so we'll just put these guys over here. So we have,
That was into religion as well. And he connects philosophy, religion, and psychology together.
cool.
I wasn't sure if he was a philosopher.
Yeah, he's in like the psychoanalysis 100%. Philosophy, a bit of an overlap, but he would not be considered like a philosopher alone. Just because of the nature of things that he's like communicating with. James.
So I think.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh my god.
I think Red Book was published in 2009. So Jung didn't want to publish after his long time after his death.
Things family still wanted to publish it. That's what he wanted to have it. But it's weird how he didn't want the world to see this final thought.
A lot of people don't.
James.
Just a thought. Basically, when you mentioned earlier that what you had asked if somebody had knowledge of something and you still do the complete opposite of the correct decision, I wonder if it has anything to do with Jung mentioning that each person has essentially four facets. And you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there's a feminine side, masculine side, the anima, no, not the anima, the kind of like the darker side, which kind of is stuff that you don't really tell people about yourself. And then the fourth one is the one that you want to portray to the public. And those all kind of all work in tandem. But then I wonder if perhaps in a given situation, the darker side of you tells you to do this. So instead of doing the correct decision, that part of your personality tells you to do that. So it's kind of like this conflict with the four people in you. I wonder if that has anything to do with doing the wrong thing when you know you shouldn't be doing it. And then my second point that I wanted to make that I think could be interesting to people is that Jung was also quite interested in esotericism, which he didn't really speak too much about because even today, I think it is frowned upon in academic circles. Yes.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, we can have different theoretical perspectives to explain things, right? Like as for explanatory power. So, right. So part of the reason side over here is explaining stuff. So when we say explaining, you're talking about like the what, like what's going on, or the why. Why did that happen? And you explain yourself. You're like, whoa. Like I don't know if you guys were here. I think I was here a few weeks ago. Maybe I was here when I was saying that when you act in a certain way, society expects you to explain yourself. And if you do weird shit, they'll be like, what the fuck are you doing? And you have to say something, right? Otherwise, for example, maybe you're suffering from a state of catatonia, which is a symptom of schizophrenia. So that is not a thing. And we're going to explain that. Your lack of explaining, we will now do it for you, right? And it's some symptom within our DSM encyclopedia, right? And so when we talk about explaining, philosophically, there are good explanations. They have some merit to them. And some explanations that we're like, I don't really know, right? I'm not really sure about this explanation. Some things don't make sense. From when we're trying to be reasonable, or when we say making sense, how does it fit together? So making sense is like consistency or coherence. So when you look at the brick wall behind you, it's fit together like a puzzle piece, and there's no piece missing, right? And when you look at a damaged wall, it's all fucked up, right? There's holes in it, and things aren't level. It's fallen over. The structural integrity is not there. And so so there's the content of being explained, or the subject, right? And then there's like the form of the explanation. So that's like how we're doing it. And so the form of the explanation, that we would want to be what we would call like a sound argument. So this quickly goes into our module of critical thinking. So if I had the online course, I would say, now everybody go and watch that and come back, right? And then 30 hours later, you're like, that was a lot of content, Achilles. You just didn't shut up. And I'm like, I know, it was good, wasn't it? And so once we know what a sound argument is, basically that we have premises that support our conclusion. So what are you talking about? What does this mean? Well, if the conclusion of what I'm explaining is the top of the table, right? The legs of the table are the things supporting it. And so there's different kinds of arguments. This table has like one main leg and then 4 other legs. So there can be 4 pieces of evidence that connect to one fundamental premise that is the main thing that is supporting some conclusion I'm drawing, right? That table has 4 legs that are supporting the top, which would be the conclusion, okay? And the way that we structure our arguments, or when I say argument, that could be an ambiguous term, like you're fighting with me, like why are you arguing with me? We don't mean it in that connotative definition sense. We mean that it's reasonable, that what the person is saying makes sense to us, right? And so to visualize, we have premise 1 connected to premise 2, connected to conclusion. And each of these can be true or false, right? And the way it's connected determines its validity or invalidity. And then the combination of these 2 things determines soundness. And that would mean that the argument as a whole is sound. Now, when we have arguments or structures of reasoning, we're looking for a conclusion that is based on true premises. So for example, recently, like to connect what we've been saying to discussions in our chat group, people have been vigorously talking about the war in Israel-Palestine area. And recently there was a confusion about, there was a bombing of a hospital, and they didn't know, some people were saying that it was intentional to hurt Palestinians, but then the other side was that no, there was Hamas terrorists inside there, and that was the focus, right? And so on one side, you have people saying that this is evidence of like genocide from the Israelis. The other side, it's the Israelis are trying to be proactive and reduce any terrorist threat, right? And so you could be citing some premise. There's bombing of a hospital, right? And then the premise 2 would be the bombing was intentional to kill Palestinians who were like, cannot even defend themselves at all. Right? And so that, the first one we would say is true. Like, we know the hospital was bombed. Okay. Right? Maybe we don't know. We could talk about that. Because even in the Ukraine defense against Putin and the Kremlin, utilizing Russian people to hurt themselves in Ukraine, some people would say that a lot of these images are not even real. They're just deep fake, for example. So how do we know what is real? That's the first thing, is the quality of evidence. So in the premises, we have to talk about evidence. Right? What are the standards, for example, of admissibility of evidence? So when we go to religion, one of the big things for evidence here is called scripture. One example is the Bible. You could talk about the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, etc., right? And so these texts, right? Like, it's not like we're super in the future or like the Matrix, and you like plug yourself in and you have this mystical experience, and then you get up and you're like, holy crap, that was intense. How could you not believe now? Right? Or like you go to the shaman in Mexico, they have the frog in the tent. You know what I mean? They say, okay, sit in this tent, you can drink this stuff, and we're not going to let you out. Not for a long time. You're staying in the tent. Like, okay, so don't burn yourself. There's a fire in there. Like, all right. And then you drink the stuff, and then you go on a super DMT trip. And then after, you're like, holy crap, like that was insane. How could you not believe? Right? There was some experience without drugs or some AI intervention or whatever. Some people have their own personal experiences. They see God. Right? Like, I knew somebody that said that God's eyeball was as big as the sun. And the reason that God could not engage with people's free will is any movement would just destroy the earth because of how big God was. When you really look at the definition of God, like, you think God is bigger than the universe. So the sun is a very small entity compared to the universe. So there's these different forms of evidence. Okay. And it's important to understand, like, because there's major things that are going on in general human belief. Religion is one of them. So we always want to keep that on the board. And so the admissibility of that, what is it? That's the first one. And that's going to determine whether this is true or false. Now, the second thing, to say that the intentions behind, like the bombing of the hospital, for example, was X, well, now you have to prove intent, right? That's a different thing. And so the Israelis may have had information, for example, that there was terrorist people there with missiles or something that's bad, right? One of the other things that you'll see is that they notified people in the hospital to leave the hospital in advance because they have to remove the terrorist threat. Sam Harris, a neuroscientist and philosopher, he talks about how there's a dichotomy or an asymmetrical relationship between Hamas fighters and Israeli fighters, that the Hamas fighters will hide themselves behind innocent civilians, right, as a warfare strategy or tactic. But Israelis don't do that. And the difference is that if Israelis did, the Hamas fighters would not apprehend themselves or would not be hesitant to killing the civilians. The very intent is to kill the civilians. So it wouldn't have the same effect, right? And I think that's a pretty compelling argument to make.
I mean, they said the same things in Ukraine. They said that a lot of things, like a lot of battles, the civilians were hurt only because, they, like, the Ukrainian soldiers were hiding it. But in reality, like, if Russians stopped attacking Ukraine, like, the war would end, right?
Exactly. Very good.
So, yeah, like, of course, ugly combat strategies are always used to get results. But the fact is, it shouldn't be happening in the first place.
True. And when we look at the Ukraine, sorry, you good? I'm trying to read nonverbal behavior to see if people want to say something, because sometimes they do something. In the Ukraine Kremlin situation, Ukraine is very, very conscious of all of the targets that they hit, and they try to reduce as many Russian casualties as possible. Whereas, just like you're saying, in the reverse, though, the Russians have been obliterating civilian targets in Ukraine for over a year, almost 2 years now, right? So there's a huge difference here. And the Ukrainians have recently got access to very long-range missiles, and so can hit many, many, many targets if they wanted to that were civilian, if that was the nature of the case. With the Hamas Israeli situation, it is a bit challenging because of that strategy of hiding themselves behind. So like last week, they were in ambulances, for example, and were transporting weaponry and other personnel in Palestinian ambulances, which is a problem, right? You know where the restroom is? That way. Straight and right. Yeah. So, okay. So admissibility of evidence and standards of evidence. Important to understand, because if it's not correct, if it's not real, then what happens is our argument quickly becomes unsound. So what we're saying just doesn't make sense. Right? And so you look at like Donald Trump, right? Okay. Trump will say things, doesn't matter if it makes sense. It's predominantly focused on how he's saying it, because the medium of communication is how he's persuading people, right? If he was really concerned about facts, he wouldn't where he's at, right? Almost his entire political campaign is simply just a form of entertainment, because people it makes them feel good watching him act like an idiot or whatever, right? And so when we talk about these different strategies, being very analytical or focusing on like entertainment value presentation, Daniel Kahneman and Tversky talked about these cognitive biases that human beings engage in, like the availability heuristic or the representative heuristic, right? And so Kahneman wrote a book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Kahneman, how do I pronounce it? Kahneman. So we have system 1 and system 2 thinking. System 1 is our biased evolutionary mode of thinking, which would be the brainstem and the limbic system. The limbic system is your emotional part of your brain, right? Your fight or flight systems. System 2 comes after, is the prefrontal cortex. That's where you're like, does this guy make any sense? Right? Or girl, whoever it is. Right? So that's your prefrontal cortex. And that is the thing we're using to say, is this reasonable? Does this argument, is the evidence true? Is it structured well? Right? And that's really your determining soundness. We're engaging in our critical thinking skills. So what Trump does is he's all system 1. Okay? And unfortunately, a lot of politicians will kind of do one or the other. But really, the best person to persuade the people is to acknowledge that some people will be sensitive to system 2 thinking, whereas other people will be sensitive to system 1 thinking. And so you really got to do a combination of both, right? And myself, when I'm here communicating, I try to like do a little bit of both in the sense that I'm like a little engaging, you know? Like I don't know. There's some theatrical funness I'm doing when I'm doing it, right? And Bezat will be like, okay, that's enough. He's like, get back to the content, which is good. We got our evidence, the form of the argument, going back to explain. So, yeah.
So I learned that system 1 is the fast system, and system 2 is the slow system.
Mhm.
System 1 is based off of fear, immediate survival needs, fight or flight, that sort of thing. And so I think it's like 8 alternates or something like that. One watches the other or something. I'm not really exactly, but so like system 1 would be like take Israel. System 1 would be an automatic reaction to their behavior as self-defense. System 2 would challenge that and say maybe they just want territory. Sure. You don't really know which one's true, but something like that.
It's how we're approaching the evidence or the situation, right? If we're just automatically basing judgments off of like how we feel or the first thing that comes to mind, intuition has the hazard of being biased, like the representative heuristic. Representative heuristic is when we have a category like lawyer, what are traits that come to mind when we say lawyer? It'd be deceitfulness or liar, right? And then the availability heuristic is what has most recently happened in memory to you with reference to this. So if you had a lawyer that helped you out with some case and she was super nice and just very loving and nurturing, you'd be like, oh, lawyers are just beautiful people. They take their time, they talk to you. And that's based off of your personal experience with the most recent person you were with, right? And so the thing is that these biases are subjective to, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just trying to read that side of the board.
Okay. I can go over it if you like.
Sorry.
All right.
I'm trying to make sure I understand.
You're saying, sorry, go ahead.
I'm scribbling as fast as I think, and clearly the scribbling is not at that level. That's like super, I don't even know. So, okay, when we're explaining stuff, okay, a few months ago in the summertime, I talked about the criteria for evaluating theories from a scientific level, the philosophy of science, right? And this is based on Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions. One, he calls it the criteria of adequacy. So whenever we're evaluating an explanation, we can evaluate it in this way, right? So one is, so we're going to put it down here. So one is coherence. Simplicity, falsification, prediction, and testability. No, scope. Falsification is test. All right. So just because somebody gives us some explanation for something doesn't mean it's necessarily good, because we have competing explanations. So if somebody says, well, when was the earth created? I know. I read it somewhere. 5,000 years ago. What? 5,000 years? Are you sure about that? Because like the pyramids are like 5,000 years. Like, yeah, 5,000 years, right? It was read to me in this book. And like, okay, maybe. And so what we would say is, for it to be coherent, if the earth, this is our explanation, right? We kind of just go through the list. So coherently, it would contradict a whole bunch of stuff. One of those things would be like the existence of fossils. You'd say these fossils clearly look to be like millions of years old. So how can it be the case that these rocks, quote unquote fossils, exist, and that goes against your theory of the origin of the planet, right? That's one property.
Could be mistaken too, though.
It could be. So what you'd have, so you would, every time there's a contradiction, there's a problem of coherence. I understand. You would have to, thank you for coming. Thank you. Thank you. You're going to have to make now an assumption and re-explain that in a different way, right? So our one explanation is now just multiplied by 2. Which is fine. Maybe that's the simplest explanation isn't necessarily the best one. Occam's razor, he was like,
Sorry for Nate.
hello, my friend. That's
I just
okay.
finished my assignment.
That's cool. This is Morty.
Nice to meet you.
Have a seat. So simplicity right here is based on the Occam's razor, right? He was a monk, and he has the quote, "Don't posit plurality without necessity." So don't make up random shit unless you absolutely have to, right? When you're explaining stuff. The most complicated way to explain something may not be the best. It's better to try to find the most simplest way, right? It's not always the case, because sometimes the universe just is complicated. Like quantum mechanics is not a very simple, like the math works out in certain ways, like in its own way, but it's pretty complicated. It's not just like arithmetic. It's a fundamentally, like it's an advanced form of mathematics that it takes to understand it. But it would appeal to the coherence notion. Quantum mechanics. We have, let's put QM as another explanation for the cosmos, right? Then we have falsification or testability. So like, what's that? Falsification. What are you talking about? What that means is that we have to have some way to prove the thing wrong. If it's always true, then we have no standard of correctness, right? And so Karl Popper was the individual that developed this idea in the early 1900s-ish. He said that Marxism is unfalsifiable. Marx's theory in the Communist Manifesto is something that's untestable. You can't actually check. There's no way to check if it's real, right? Just the way that the theory is constructed, the way that the explanation is constructed, is it's not accurately mapped on to reality in such a way that we can connect it. So what you can think of is reality is here, okay? Humans are just hanging out. They're in there. Just cool. We exist, right? I think so. I feel so, right? And then our explanations are kind of up here. Humans are like, boom, I have devised an understanding of that which is. And you bring up Heidegger and say, no. Heidegger says no, which is fine. We can talk about it too. So humans have developed some way to make sense of this utilizing language. Our brains have grown to a certain point. So let's draw our brain here, right? So this part of our brain, our prefrontal cortex, at the least, has been able to put ideas together in such a way that we can represent reality with symbols. And so we can utilize this system here from Kuhn, super cool, to evaluate whether those symbols have any relevance to reality or not.
Very cool that you mentioned that, because language is a man-made thing. It's not something that's normal from our own physiology, which is why I guess the Egyptians and all the ancient cultures used to communicate through symbols. And Carl Jung actually, he talks about that as well in dreams, where our brains in their true primitive form can't comprehend words. That's why the dreams and like the meaning that it has to us is expressed through symbols that we have to decipher on our own.
Awesome.
So, no, that's not the language of symbols.
Thank you. Okay, so when we talk about the falsification property, what that's doing, so like let's say you have a balloon, right? And there's a little thing there. And your friend is standing here and they're like, hey, if they don't hold on to the string, the balloon, assuming there's helium or hydrogen in there, will just go up. And then it'll pop or deflate in the sky and maybe I don't know what happens to it, right? So we want to make sure that our explanations of things, just we call this a theory, doesn't just fly up into the ether of nothingness, but it is in some ways tied to that which exists. I'm going to call that reality, right? It's real. That's what we mean by reality. Or reality is that which exists independent of all humans. If all the humans were just like, fuck this place, and we just went somewhere else, whatever's left over is reality, meaning that it has nothing to do with what we believe. So when you test something, you're trying to say, is there a connection between this theory and reality? Is, whoever this person is, are they able to hold on to that balloon? And if they can, that's good. You want to make sure what you think is real. Another example is the map theory. So Dimitri's on a ship and he is sailing into the vast sea and then gets knocked off the ship, right? And then lands on some island and then in his exhausted state finds a tube. And he's able to open the tube. It had some weird lock on it because of his strength and his intuition and ingenuity. He gets it open, right? And inside this tube is a map. And the map says, if you follow this pathway, you're going to get the treasure at the end. He's like, shit. Totally thought that getting off that boat sucked. But if that didn't happen, I wouldn't have found this cool map, right? The map, the meaning or significance of the concept of mapness, whether it's Google Maps or back in the day, they used to sell maps at gas stations and that you'd have to like, as a driving hazard, look at that thing, right? I don't even,
They still do, actually. I love traditional maps, man.
that's
It's
cool.
the coolest thing ever. Get around
No,
something material.
coolest thing ever was
Yeah.
making those maps. Like, imagine making like that was like a whole job, making a map and then like the accuracy, the style. Oh, that's amazing.
Very good. So the relevance of this map actually is based on like the real world, whatever this is. Now this is the world, and this is the map. The lower I go, I have to like bend over or kneel down or something. So there's supposed to be some scaling between the map and reality, right? If it says that you are on, this is the 401 and you were going north, and then you're like, shit, it's supposed to be like this. Whoever printed it had it the wrong way because now you're at the lake. You're like, supposed to be in like fucking Barrie right now, not Lake Ontario. This is ridiculous. Fucks up your whole day, right? So when it comes to theory, which is explanation, which is going to be everything in the religious category, all of that stuff, everything in the category of science, and fundamentally just anything we really believe, whatever these two people are arguing about, right? Whatever it is. You owe me $50. Like, what are you talking about? $50. And we argue about it. Fuck. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we can test stuff. And that's what Popper meant. We have to falsify. Now, sometimes, like in psychoanalysis, as one in his paper, that was like the other theoretical paradigm of the time that was unfalsifiable. You can't test it. It's always true. There's always a way to like massage the explanation so it evades testing. Like a magical little monster that you can't see and just runs around the ground. We flip the lights on, you're like, where is it? It's gone. Okay? You always want to test it. Now, some things they cannot be tested. For example, the Big Bang Theory. You're like, fuck. Everybody thinks that's true, in contrast to the world is flat. Maybe. And then you go see Jeff Bezos, you're like, bro, here's $1 million. We're going to test if the world's flat. He's like, all right.
Please. Let's have a debate.
Puts you in his penis spaceship, and then you go up into the sky, and then you go around the planet, and you're like, you have observed it's a sphere-ish, but then you're like, no, you just had TV screens on the windows, right? I'm evading falsification here. You know, I'm going to re-explain the data or the information. That's a different thing, but I'm throwing another thing. Okay, anyways, point is, explanations. We have Marx, we have psychoanalysis. Okay, now these two are not falsifiable. The Big Bang is not falsifiable. Why? Because you can't really go out and test it. You can't create a new Big Bang and see what happens. That's just way beyond our capacity as human beings. Okay? However, if it is the case that you can make predictions, that's something else now, right? For example, quantum computing. If quantum mechanics was not a viable thesis, then quantum computing would not be something you could engineer because it would not be based on physics that is real, right? So maybe we can't test it, but maybe you can predict that there's going to be some other reality over here. And if you go and make the jump and it actually is there, that is kind of like a test, or I guess, yeah, it's kind of falsifiable test, but it's, you know, a little different. Okay, now scope is how big is the map? How much does the map of reality get covered? And yeah, okay. So this is what we're going to utilize to determine whether our explanations here are good explanations or not. What is the quality of our explanations? Okay. And really it's just beliefs in general. You can have really, really complicated beliefs that are the basis of our whole religion or an entire body of science. And some bodies of science have kind of been a little shitty, right? Because there were certain biases embedded in them that promoted very unlikable social consequences, like eugenics, for example, right? We fucked up. So we got to correct that. Now, the difference between religion and science is religion just accepts it's true no matter what. And some people, they will like throw a spear at you or a big rock. Like, you fucking with me in my religion? I'm gonna kill you. Right? And that is a social consequence. Whereas science is like, we don't know what's going on. We're gonna keep on finding out. And we're going to engage in some mechanism, which is what we call the scientific method, some process to make sure whatever I see is real. And so, like, for example, like glasses. If I want to really make sure that I can see the thing, I put my glasses on, I was like, okay, I can see it. Take them off, like, it's still fuzzy, but okay, now I know. I have some mechanism to refine my ability to know whatever is there is really there, right? And so science is just a way to say, is the explanation true? Is it real? Is it really the case? And so, all right, I'm just like fucking talking here, right? So I just do that sometimes. Basically, to be wise, let's make sure we're in the room for the right reasons here. To be wise is to say that things make sense, which is to say that whatever I have explained to myself or to other people is something that meets these criteria in some way. And that's a good thing. Why? Because if he's going for that treasure box, it fucking better be there. Right? But if you come to the first thing and it says there's gonna be a palm tree or some thing, and you go there and there's nothing there, you're like, what is this map representing? You know? In video games, I don't know if I can't remember the last time, but if there was an experience where you're following the map in the game and the thing's really not there, you're gonna be like, fuck this game. I'm not playing it anymore. You know, done with it, right? And, you know, that's similar to, like, for me, as a 9-year-old boy, I was like, I can't do this anymore when it came to Catholicism. Oh, this just makes me super uncomfortable. I just can't do it for whatever reason. So I had a map, and I was like, no, it ought not be like this. If there was a different map, I would have been like, I'll continue down the river, right? For example, if the map said there's no waterfall, but your intuition of canoeing, you're like, wait a minute, I know when the river behaves this way, there's a waterfall coming up or whatever. You're going to listen to yourself, or you're going to listen to the map that may be inaccurate, right? Maybe you keep it, you get out and you just walk ashore for a bit, just to make sure you don't go over the edge. So, okay, explanation. Explanation is important. Why did we get to explanation? There was some reason. Being reasonable. I think it's just, yeah, we're explaining something. We were talking about explaining. I don't know. Anyways, we're there. So it's cool. So basically, to be wise, this is one of our tools in our philosophical toolkit. It's important to have that with you when you're on your own and when you have some dialogue with somebody else. You say, well, I don't want to just, what you say to me doesn't really make sense. So from a social level, there's a way for me to deal with things that I don't really agree with, right? Someone says something, I'm like, that's fucking bullshit. I said it to myself. But then the next thing I say is, maybe I'm wrong. That way I avoid the arrogance fucking pothole. Because being an arrogant person is unwise as well. We talked about standing your ground. You were here for that. Yeah. I talked about a lot of stuff now at last. Was that last week?
Yeah.
Yes. Anyways.
Can I have a personal observation about wisdom?
Yes.
So I was thinking how wisdom doesn't necessarily correlate linearly with time.
Mhm.
A lot of times people say, oh, you have to like be 50 or 60 years old to have wisdom. But then there's also people our age or younger that have acquired a lot more wisdom than people in the later stages of life, where I believe wisdom comes through life experiences.
Mhm.
So the more life experiences you have in a short amount of time technically correlates to the same amount of life experience that took someone else 10 years to go through.
I agree with that, but it's also about perception. Like, there's a lot of people that, like, not some people can have all of these difficult things happening to them, but they're not going to get past them. Like, you know how some people can fall into like addiction, and instead of, you know, overcoming the situation, they get lost in it. So yeah, but of course I do agree with the majority of what you're saying. I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
All right, so there's the, like, wisdom comes with age. We put a question mark there. So the reason wisdom would come from age is just because you've learned things from experience, right? Like you've done stuff and you're like, I know what happens when you go over there, it's fucked. You know what I mean? Just don't go over there. And someone may not agree with you. Like, you're a fucking asshole. And they're like, I'm going over there. And they're like, holy shit, he was totally right.
And you get the wisdom.
Still an asshole, but he's totally right. Dimitri is not an asshole either. And well, then it would be a different way, right? There would be listening. So the lover of wisdom is like, you can just listen to somebody. You're like, Neil deGrasse Tyson is correct. Doesn't matter, right? I'm going to listen to whatever he says. I don't care what it is, right? And so that would be an appeal to authority. And sometimes it might be true. How do we determine that? What is the nature of expertise? It means the person has minimal failure or errors, right? They demonstrate knowledge over their subject area, and they have a sense of mastery at the very least of that subject area. And so you can appeal to them as an authority because 99.9% of the time, they're not wrong. It doesn't mean they're not going to be wrong, though. It just means statistically, they're usually right.
Like in terms of what you just said about the physicist and wisdom in general, it'd be like wisdom basically being about risk. It's about risk management. It's about avoiding risk. It's about being able to do what needs to be done with minimal risk to failure. I mean, without risk, there's no value in wisdom. And that's where, knowledge of physicist comes in, because he knows what to do. He knows what's going on. The risk is minimal if you let him manage it. So he has authority in terms of managing the risk involved in whatever you're doing. Right? That's wisdom.
Like they're really good at math. I don't know if anyone's seen the Oppenheimer movie, but at one point, Oppenheimer was like, you're better at calculations than me. I'll just trust your math. Right? Even though he was like the main character and like the director of the Manhattan Project. Right? And so there's skill at something. Skill is very mechanical, though, as a thing, right? Like playing an instrument, there's a mechanics to it. And so when we talk about wisdom as avoiding error, because there's more than one thing here. There's error and then there's risk. Risk of having an error, and I can listen to you so that I don't make an error because you know where the errors are. And so it's wise for me to listen to you if you've demonstrated authority, right? And then I don't have errors. So that's good. If I don't have you there, that risk calculation, I can't make that risk calculation. I can't use you as a property to be like, don't go over there because there's some fucking bullshit. You know what I mean? Now when it comes to error, that's why I'm going through these tools, right? Like I went through the structure of an argument, properties to evaluate explanations, some examples of explanations. And the reason I'm doing that is so that we can engage our critical thinking skills to reduce the error we have in how we think about things. And this is very like reasoning based. The well-being stuff, we haven't really gotten too much to that today. Recently, I've went through like individual decisions and how we can do things on our own, like we did last time, and then social things. You've been to one or two.
One.
So this is your second round.
Yes.
That's it?
Yeah.
Oh, you feel like you've been here forever. Okay, so when socially, like when you guys, if you get the chance, you can watch the previous videos that at length explains other things. But socially, there's things that can happen that are errors in that way, right? And we don't want to do that. You know what I'm saying? And we go back, we can talk about Israel Hamas then, if you want to. There are some things you just say that's not good. You know what I mean? And so that would be like a social error, which we could also say is a form of unethical behavior. And we have our ethical principles that we implement on our actions or behavior to reduce those errors. And so it's wise, I'm gonna say wise, I guess like risk is like a certain degree of probability. You know, like I can replace that word with probability. So there's a probability that this outcome may occur. You know, so in deductive reasoning, if your conclusion is based on true premises the conclusion will always be true. In inductive reasoning, it's a probability whether it's true or not. Right? So I have come to room 661B Wednesday at 8:15. Achilles was there talking about stuff. Today at 8:15, there's a probability he will be there talking about stuff. It's not necessarily true. But if I say on planet Earth there is gravity, the Ryerson Library 662 or 661B is on planet Earth. Therefore, there will be gravity in 661 2 or B. That's deductive. It's necessarily the case that there will be gravity here because of the form of the reasoning. It goes from a general category to a specific. Whereas the other one went from a specific, I was in this room, will he be there again? That's inductive reasoning. So when it comes to risk, if we're talking about reasoning, there would be no risk in the structure of the argument, but maybe in my ability to think of it correctly. So deductive reasoning is always correct if it's done correctly. If the reasoner, I could fuck it up and not think about it clearly. Like I was doing a stats problem yesterday and I missed one number, so my calculation was wrong. Right? It was me that was the problem, not the calculation, because I forgot a number. You know, I just didn't read it. It's really tired.
There's also, there's also false premises and in terms of like my background's economics, and the problem is always that there's never a situation where you have full information.
Very good.
It's not perfect information that you're gonna have. So basically, you have assumed premises, and there may be false premises. You know, like one premise would be assuming the intent of Israel, for example.
Sure.
You know, you don't really know. You have to assume something. And that's like part of the problem in psychology is that it relies on self-report. So as soon as you're assuming something, you won't really know what someone's thinking unless they tell you.
And then
Even then they might not know, or I don't know. But
so we can go off. There's properties, right, that we can work with here. And so one is overt behavior, how someone's acting, right? So Israel hasn't attacked Gaza for is it 15 years? It's been a long time since there was any kind of direct conflict or declaring war on Hamas. Like that happened after, as a consequence to the attack to Israel on October 7th, 6th, right? And so there are observables and then other information we can draw from inference. So what you're talking about is called non-monotonic reasoning. And what that is so Achilles is assuming that P1 and P2 are the only premises. And so and that's a closed set. I only have these two variables. If these two variables are the only things, then this is the necessary conclusion, right? But non-monotonic reasoning would be like, yeah, but there's actually stuff we may not know. And that's true, that there are potentials for things we just don't know. And that's fine, right? It's just that you just need to be aware of that and just say, given these properties, this is the conclusion. And then if you say, well, but this is a new property, then we just have to rewrite. It's like the inference is the best explanation, right?
eventually you get the chaos theory.
Okay, we can talk about that.
You know, like chaos and risk being like almost the same thing. Because there's too many variables. Like in finance, it's all about chaos. You know, you'll never know what 300 million people are going to do next year.
Mhm.
So there's no way to predict what the economy is going to be like 100%.
Okay, chaos. What is chaos?
Systems, and it's so complicated, it's like chaos.
So complicated is one thing we can say.
Disorder.
It's actually ordered, really ordered.
Okay, I'm gonna put okay,
Yes, is or.
disorder / order. We're gonna have to have two definitions of chaos now, because I was gonna go with disorder, but I'm gonna listen to what you have to say about order.
Curious.
Yeah.
It's like linear equations. It's all equations.
Okay.
The chaos thing, as opposed to like probability.
Okay, so as opposed to, so chaos is different than probability.
So technically or theoretically, if you had perfect information on the system, you could predict it 100% of the time. Well,
Yes.
that's chaos.
Is it though?
Supposedly, I don't know, like,
No, it's okay. I want you tell me. I don't know.
that's what it is, like in finance. Like, if you were to, be able to measure all the variables perfectly, you would know what was gonna happen, money off of it.
Yeah.
Assuming you're the only one. with
What about like
perfect
entropy? Like it would entropy stem
No, but-
into
One second.
Probabilities related to quantum mechanics
Probably for, okay.
and not chaos. Why, I don't know how the two sort of mix, you know. I don't think anyone, that's like the probability versus the order of chaos is like, fundamental.
Okay, let's pause on that for a second.
Oh, I thought that that's what he was talking about, like entropy. Like, you know, in biology, they have like the whole equation to how to calculate, I don't know, what is it called again? Of a system or energy unavailable to do the work.
Is that entropy?
Yeah.
Of a system or available energy to do the work.
Let me just double check. It's a measure of a disorder of a system or energy unavailable to do the work. So yeah, it's kind of like measuring chaos.
This-
It was related to probability, like it's,
We're going beyond, a little beyond my expertise, which is totally good, because we're gonna like, how do we approach things we don't know much about, right? And so first, we wanna like, I have not much room here, but we wanna define our terms. So we have some terms we're going with here. So you said available energy to do the work. So work is almost like an intended outcome that I'm going towards. And then that in this definition, entropy would be the energy required to get there. So if I needed to get something, a piece of metal to 4,000 degrees Celsius, entropy would be the energy from its current state to that 4,000 degrees, right?
I guess.
If we're going with that definition. I don't know what to say about that. I'm not sure how that relates to
I
chaos.
honestly haven't thought of entropy in a while, but when he said organized chaos, it just like clicked. I'm like, oh, entropy.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's great.
Entropy might be that threshold point of it being before chaos to chaos.
I don't know.
So one thing so for me, one of the fundamental assumptions of this whole thing is I believe in the cosmos, which is an ordered universe. So we can talk about that, but that's like a big thing.
I think you actually gave a perfect example when you were talking about during going into the process because it's a biological term. So it's like what happens in the process of it going through the transformation is measuring the entropy. So what you said about it going through like 400 degrees, I think that's exactly what it meant. Yeah.
When we talk about it as work, because entropy in the universe has to do with like balance in the universe, doesn't it? That like, see, again, I'm not a physicist. Like this is going beyond. I'm more of a psychological guy because I study that as a science, which is fine. How do we approach things we don't know about? This is what we're learning now, at least for me. So, okay, for me, I assume an orderliness in the universe or reality, right? And that I would say is in contrast to chaos. So chaos may have multiple definitions, and maybe chaos within information systems is different than in physics. That could be one thing, right? So so when we talk about our reasoning, right, we want to make sure we're not committing the fallacy of equivocation. What is the fallacy of equivocation, Ty? She's like, I'll tell you in 6 months when I've done critical thinking. It is when the same term has two different meanings. We're equivocating the same term, right? So chaos may have multiple meanings. And so if to be unphilosophical would be to assume my definition is the only definition, and then be like, wow, you're wrong because you're not using it in the way I expect. That's unphilosophical and unreasonable and unwise. To have wisdom would be to say, well, Dean, what do you mean when you say chaos? Like when you use that term, how do you use it, or what do you mean by it, right? And then he says, he gives me next to talk about what you just said, right? You say those things. I like the word complicated because for me, when I go back to the cosmological view of things, It may just be that chaos is information or phenomena that is beyond our ability to see its order because of our limitations on human processing or in our mathematical technology, just as how far our math has gotten. And we're like, this is what we're working with. We're drawing shit in the sand. We're like, ugh, it's like there's no more sand, there's just rocks, right? That's a limitation. Computational limitation. We're using sticks and rocks, there's a computational limitation in your math. When you say that chaos is ordered, with my definition, that would be a contradiction, right? But it could just be that I have a different definition. And so, yeah.
Well, like physics itself isn't necessarily, like physics isn't just solely inside chaos, right? When I talk about chaos, it's more about latent variables like people, decision making, emotions. Like people themselves are an idea. They're, each individual life is a latent variable. We're more than the sum of our parts.
Yes.
Right? It's just thought effect. We're latent variables. And there is no probability to those things. So
when you say probability, what do you mean when you say probability?
like there's a chance of anything happening or within a range or whatever. And it's truly random, like in the sense of quantum mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
How, well, I don't really know, but I just know in general that quantum mechanics has an element of probability that you can't really predict, and you use those probability equations to fill their problem. But like with people, I mean, there's a chance they can do whatever, but it's not necessarily based on probability. It's more based on a long, really, really long equation, a bunch of variables that you don't know, that you can't measure because you need to be psychic or something. But if you were
Okay.
able to measure them, you would instantly know what they would do in a certain situation because of blah blah blah, whatever. Like if someone's hungry, they're gonna eat, right?
Well, yeah, so as an economist, there's the behavioral economics, right? We're trying to predict the behavior of people, and the stock market is a big motivation for this and these kind of things. I get that. Yeah. Like this also goes into like the hard and soft science approach and how the scientific method is different depending on the phenomena we're observing. And remember that prediction is one of the 5 properties we're using here to understand some explanation or theoretical paradigm, right? And so psychology, a lot of it is correlations, right? So there's a certain degree of variability on whether a person will do such a thing. And the other problem is, what are the properties we're even measuring? Like when they talk about psychological constructs, like for example, aggression can be said as like a psychological construct. And we would say, well, what is the probability of this person becoming aggressive in these circumstances or situations, right? And yeah, so this is like a topic in itself that we can go into. I'm running out of space, which I can make more. But yeah, I think that, yeah, this is interesting. When it comes to order and disorder, I would just approach it from the perspective that it's us that's the problem, not necessarily the universe. I don't want to assume it's unknowable before I've even tried. Because I could be it could be like the fallacy of ignorance. I don't know. So my lack of knowledge doesn't mean that it or the alternative is true or false.
But in a way, wouldn't chaos always be like, even if we weren't on the planet, like there's natural disasters. Like I know that some of them we did cause, but there were disasters before we were there. Like, right, the eras, the metering, right? Like there were things
Island of
happening
plastic.
while we weren't here. Yes, we definitely make things worse, but
Sure.
I think chaos has always came as part of existence, I guess.
Well, like chaos, if we make it human-centered, okay, go ahead.
It's not always human centered, like weather systems are chaos systems.
But it might just be that it's just our ability to understand it because it's so complicated. It just appears chaotic to us. But if we had a bigger brain,
No, but with, in terms of weather systems, that was the thinking before. But now it's like they have, certain equations that they can run through a supercomputer and it will predict the weather, the air masses and everything else like that.
Mhm.
I mean, like it's, our information about, our theories about the weather are not perfect, but it's sort of getting there.
it's better.
And they're saying, what they're saying is that it's all, the weather is just chaos, you know, it's predictable. Every single thing about it is predictable. Nothing's based on probability. That's the basic difference, so.
Okay.
With the chaos and whatever else.
Yeah, we would have to expand our understanding of chaos. I'm not a person that knows much about chaos personally. My approach has just been chaos doesn't exist.
Positive.
It's just that we are limited. You know, we're colorblind in some ways. We just can't see what's really there because we have evolved and to this point. And so our technology has gotten so far. And I'm being optimistic, right? Like it might not be the case. Maybe there is craziness out there, but we do see repeatable, detectable patterns in this existence. And again, I want to construct this in a falsifiable way. If we went to another part of the universe and we did some tests over there, would it be the same? Right? Not really sure because we haven't really been there yet. Like I can go to a different part of the universe. I'll do it right now. Right? But we don't really mean that. We mean like go to Alpha Centauri, like that. And in a video game I have, we can do that, which is cool. But yeah, so one of the assumptions cosmologically is that the fundamental forces are uniform in this universe that we have. And there are different perspectives on that, you know, like the multiverse theory. There may be universes that have different variables, like the speed of light, but it's just not the universe we live in. And if it was different, most likely wouldn't exist. It's just the way that our universe is such that it has the capacity for intelligent life. You know? So I don't know, like I think that it's just that sometimes things appear in a certain way, but its appearance is not necessarily the nature of the thing. And that would be like naive realism. So when I look at like a glass of water and I put something in there, the thing, because of refraction, looks like it's disjointed, right? This is like an old example. And so the appearance of the thing is not really the way the thing is. And so our explanation that it's chaos or chaos is, if we say chaos is ordered, we're going to have to like philosophize our terms a bit just because we want our terms to be clear and distinct. It's easier that way, right? So that way when I'm doing my reasoning, I can, with whatever's given, I can move from one premise to another. And so I want to have like concepts that when they're clear, it means the boundaries, again, we can talk about Wittgenstein and there's some shit going on. I get it. Family resemblances, we just wrote an essay on it. Talk about that. But for now, we're going to go with Aristotelian logic. We can say that all the things that are A are inside the circle. All the things that are not A are outside of the circle. All the things that are B, same logic. And then when I'm reasoning between the two, I can arrive at a different conclusion. And so when our logic gets fuzzy, like A is kind of B a little bit, and it makes it more difficult. So I would say that part of philosophizing is to distinguish these things. Now, when we talk about family resemblances, it's almost like you have A here, which is the prototype of whatever it is we're talking about. And there's like variations of A until it goes out to here. And then this thing is almost not an A, you know, but if I extend it, it could be an A. You know what I mean? And so like, or if I draw a square, I can draw like the best square I can. And then I can like draw like almost a square. And so the closer it is to the center, the more it matches the prototype. The further out it goes, the less it matches the thing. So when we're defining our terms, it's better for us to be clear and distinct so that our reasoning works out. If it is the case that we have things that are at the fringe of a prototype, we can almost just make a new prototype. So this is like my way of trying to solve the problem. And so when we talk about chaos in the context of economics, we can maybe say is a little bit different. Maybe we can just draw a different circle. We can stipulate that as a different form of chaos. The reason I was looking at you because you're your field. Like you guys are like in the same field basically, which is cool. I like that because then we can like have like more resources on the topic because it's out of my field. So for me, I'm thinking about chaos as in contrast to the cosmos. And this is from like Carl Sagan. And I guess like, you know, it would be defined as randomness. But you could also say like chaos is like unknowable. Like how else would we define chaos?
Disorder.
Like anarchy.
Disorder, sorry?
Anarchy?
Anarchy, yeah, very good. Okay, so let's write it down. So need some space here.
So if it's anarchy, then it would technically be order.
Yeah.
Because what they're doing is in orderly fashion. It's not random.
I think we're still deciding on what two sides of chaos, which I guess makes it
What's the
chaotic.
opposite of chaos?
Well, Carl Sagan would say cosmos or orderedness.
Synchronicity.
Fixability.
Yeah,
It's more like predictability versus never.
Like a gear system.
well, that would not be chaos.
No, the opposite. That's like
Yeah.
how everything is structured properly. Everything is working coordination with another. Or like synchronicity, that's what I meant by it.
Okay. Anarchy would be a form of social chaos, I would say. It's no government. So it's like, you know. So I think that we need to be specific about the level of explanation. Like, what is the scope? Remember, the scope is how big is the map? So how much are we including in the definition? So how narrow it is or how broad it is, right? And if there are different types of the thing, like social, economic, cosmological, different phenomena will be included in the thing, right? And so generally, if we talk about like, I want to talk about the concept of chaos in general. Again, we're being very philosophical here. We're making sense of things to understand them at a high-end philosophical level. It's not the well-being stuff, which is totally fine. Just like throwing on tape. So I'm going to take the position that chaos is chaos is in contrast to order. So it would be disorder. That's easy. And then you said unpredictable.
Yeah, so like take electrons, circling atoms or whatever. Like apparently there's no way to know where an electron will be at a specific time or direction or whatever. You can only draw like a probability map.
Yes.
That to me is the cosmos, because you don't know for certain. You can't really predict exactly what some kind of equation or whatever. So that's cosmos. But chaos, on the other hand, would be an equation that lets you predict exactly where the electron will be.
Chaos will let you predict exactly where it is.
Yeah.
I don't know, brother. I think that that's okay. I would say that like a probability field, right? I may not know exactly where it's going to end up, but it's within a certain, and then my inability to know exactly where it's end up most likely is just my ignorance as someone who studies particle physics. I would prefer to take that position because my acknowledgement of my ignorance allows me to refine the tools I have so that I can have better tools. Whereas if I take the position where I assume that it is just that way, now I have no reason to develop my skills any further to find a way. So in either case, you could be wrong, but in the one case, there's room for growth. That's why I would take that position.
Can you explain why you believe predicting where the electron is considered chaos? On how you said predicting where the electron is going to be is chaos. I would like you to further elaborate on it, because I didn't really.
I learned that electrons are quarks. Quarks are related to quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics are just fundamentally based on probability. It's nature. There's no why, it just is.
So being able to predict it is chaos.
Yeah, I would just use chaos in a different way. Yeah, that's interesting.
But like the key thing here is the difference between probability and everything else outside of probability. It's sort of a key thing. Like, I mean, there's different labels and you're seeing it in opposite ways or whatever, but I mean, you know, by definition, we don't really know what something based on probability will do, whatever.
Mhm.
And then there's everything else by definition you would know. So
Cool. That's cool, man. I think we philosophized, we massaged that out a little bit to kind of see what we mean, right? That was a good case study on when we are using terms in different ways, and then to see how the term is utilized in each way, right? Cool. Morty, anything you want to say?
I'm okay.
That's good. Anything? Good. Good. Go on. Cool. Talia?
Something to think about.
What's the idea for the week?
Huh?
What's the idea for the week? What have you been thinking about this week?
What I've been thinking.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. I can't say in one word.
All right, that's okay. Okay, so I think that was good for today. Unless there's anything else. Yep.
There are a few examples.
Yeah.
Like we said, anarchy, social.
Well-
There are a few other examples.
So if you use, it depends on how you define it. With what I'm defining as something that's not ordered, it would be something that doesn't really make sense in that definition. And the way that I view chaos is it kind of doesn't really exist. I'm making the assumption that it's us that are just ignorant or lacking in intelligence. Because how would we know if it is unpatterned, it doesn't have a pattern? There's no way to really test it.
Maybe the pattern is just longer than our lifespans. Yeah.
What's your definition of order?
Order would be that which fits together in a coherent system.
Coherent to the norm?
Coherent means there's no internal contradictions. And this is like there is reality. So there's like the weather patterns, there's people doing stuff. And then there's our explanation of it. So when we talk about like the law of identity, so the law of identity is 1 equals 1, right? Or the law of non-contradiction. 1 does not equal -1. Or A does not equal not A. That is in how we write our explanations and our theories, but it's also an assumption that's how reality works. And there are some issues in quantum mechanics of like, you know, a particle splitting and then having behavioral information on either side and in multiple places at once. Yeah, so we can talk about that. But that's an outlier. Like generally speaking, the cosmos is pretty ordered. Or else science wouldn't make sense. Like we wouldn't even really exist. Because like our bodies wouldn't be able to like have like internal integrity. Like you just like turn into water and be a puddle on the ground.
I think chaos is a perspective.
Yeah.
Because like I was thinking an example of how like, let's say someone who's used to living in Canada, let's say, you know, the streets, the way that cars function on the streets, it's very orderly fashion. Everything's in a straight line, you never stop signs, everyone's in their own lane, lights and all that. Then when you go to a second world country or a third world country where those don't exist, to them in that country it seems perfectly normal, but when you go there, you see it as chaos because there's cars all over the place, there's no signs, everyone's kind of doing their own thing. But to them, that's completely normal.
Yeah. So
is it perspective based, I guess?
That's kind of what I'm saying. Yeah. It looks like that way. Because if it was truly random, like I don't even think we'd be able to understand it. And maybe it does exist. It's just beyond our mind. Because our brains are always putting things into categories and like generalizing information. And there are biases from that. You know, like you could flip the argument and say everything is chaos. We only perceive and understand that which makes sense to us, which is a small fraction of what really exists. And we would never know the true chaos because you could never even see it. It's like we can see the visible light spectrum, but you can't see gamma rays or microwaves. So how would you even know it's there?
But we can. equipment they can.
Yes,
And we can see it through the equipment.
yes, that is true. Okay. That's it for today.